Tonight, Solomon Islands Prime Minister rules out a Chinese military base in his country, worried it would make it a target. Also tonight, work from home option returns for public servants in the A.C.T. as COVID-19 and flu infections rise. Good news for job keepers, but bad news for interest rates. Unemployment falls to the lowest rate in nearly half a century.
He goes for the corner! Bill Hunt wins the Origin for Queensland!
And battered and bruised, the Blues go down to the Maroons in a fiery State of Origin decider. Good evening, Dan Borshaw with ABC News. The Pacific Islands Forum has wrapped up in Fiji with renewed solidarity to face regional challenges together. Australia has been increasingly concerned with China's strategic power plays and has welcomed a Solomon Islands pledge that it won't allow China to establish a military base in the country. Pacific countries are demanding attention return to climate change. Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedjets reports from the Fijian capital, Suva.
One family, but not always in harmony. Pacific leaders have held their first face-to-face meeting in years. Their minds set on the existential challenge of climate change.
We are in unprecedented times, and this collective is at a critical juncture in its history.
They've welcomed Australia's push to co-host a UN climate conference with the Pacific. But Fiji's Prime Minister has told Australia he wants it to lift its climate ambition.
It requires that we end our fossil fuel addiction, including coal. That is our ask of Australia. That is our ask of New Zealand, the USA, India, the European Union, China.
But Anthony Albanese is standing firm.
We'll do exactly what we said we would do.
Pacific politicians and activists alike also want the Albanese government to stop approving new coal and gas projects.
I think that's what Australia needs to do, allow the Pacific Island countries to challenge them to further ambition.
But the Prime Minister insists that issue didn't come up.
Not one person today raise those questions.
Also largely unspoken, anxieties over China's rise and what it means for the Pacific. Beijing has pressed Pacific nations to sign a host of new economic and security deals recently, and there are growing signs of pushback.
They came here with their own prepared outcomes document, and it was that our members reacted against.
Solomon Islands is travelling in the opposite direction and has embraced Beijing. But after a warm meeting, Anthony Albanese says he believes Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare when he says he won't allow China to establish a military base in the country.
I think you've got to deal with people at face value. We, of course, have made very clear what Australia's position is.
Today, the forum also took some big steps towards resolving internal problems. Most of the Micronesian nations, which threatened to quit in the wake of a leadership dispute, have now decided to stay put after signing a compromise agreement orchestrated by Frank Bainimarama. Kiribati has quit the forum, but this afternoon, its president finally returned Mr Bainimarama's calls and indicated he might be willing to reconsider. Dealing with Kiribati takes deft footwork.
And of course the door is open for Kiribati.
And attention to detail.
And Stephen Jedjets joins me now from Suva. Stephen, this meeting has been a long time coming. Have leaders done enough to heal the Pacific Rift?
Well, we don't know for certain at this stage, Dan. It might take us several weeks or perhaps even months before we know whether Kiribati is going to stay within the fold. But we shouldn't let the controversy over Kiribati obscure what's happened here. It's important to remember 12 or 18 months ago, it really did look like the Pacific might be splintering and that the Pacific Islands Forum might break apart. And that led to worries, particularly amongst Pacific officials, that the region could become much more vulnerable to the Great powers and much more open to coercion. What we've seen today is an agreement struck which will keep most, if not all, of the Pacific Island nations in the same tent. And no matter what happens with Kiribati, that still represents a big victory for Pacific diplomacy.
Stephen Jedjet's reporting from Suva. A National Cabinet meeting has been called for Monday as pressure mounts on the Albanese government to reinstate support payments for workers with COVID-19 who don't get sick leave. The $750 payment ended on the 1st of July, but some Labor politicians, state and federal, have broken ranks to demand the Prime Minister reconsider the decision. Here's political reporter Jane Norman.
There's nothing casual about their predicament.
I've done everything and I get COVID and there's no help.
I get upset when I think back over the last 7 days, and I bet thousands of other people are in my situation too.
Casual workers with COVID in mandatory isolation and with no money to pay their bills.
I guess if I didn't have my father, who's semi-retired, I would be lost. I wouldn't be able to pay any rent at all.
The Albanese government stuck with plans to end the pandemic leave payment on July 1. Worth up to $750, it was designed to support workers without sick leave forced to isolate.
We inherited those decisions and we inherited $1 trillion of debt.
The Prime Minister's blaming the former government and the budget it left behind, while the aged care ministers invoked high-level medical advice.
The Chief Medical Officer is saying the best way we can spend federal money to minimise this winter wave is on vaccinations and antiviral treatments.
When asked if the Chief Medical Officer had offered advice on the payments, the Health Minister had this response.
No.
But still defended the decision.
We do regret that, obviously, but at some point we need to recognise there is not the financial capacity to continue emergency payments forever.
With COVID cases surging, some of his Labor colleagues disagree.
I'm calling for the government to extend the payments for longer.
There needs to be an urgent rethink of the $750 payment from the federal government for those who have been struck at home with the COVID-19 illness.
At least one premier's also criticised the decision to axe the payments.
It's not the right time. We are all in this together.
The pandemic has constantly thrown up awkward and unwanted choices, and the Prime Minister may be about to discover that for himself. Anthony Albanese has hastily convened a National Cabinet meeting for Monday, almost an invitation to premiers to stake their claims to federal cash. Now in the knowledge, there are some in the Prime Minister's caucus who are backing them. Jane Norman, ABC News, Canberra.
Australian public service employers are being urged to consider flexible working arrangements in response to an expected spike in COVID-19 cases in the A.C.T. The Territory is now a close second in Australia for most infections per capita, and new advice abandons the previous push for staff to return to the office.
There's been a change in tune as the Territory prepares for COVID cases to spike. The Public Service Commission is now urging departments and agencies to offer flexible working arrangements.
The situation has changed and they need to monitor and be flexible accordingly with their workforce to make sure they keep services going but also are supportive and mindful of the health, and well-being of their staff.
The public service is the largest employer in Canberra, and so that's why we're working particularly with those large employers around what they can do to be more flexible for their workforce.
Infections in the APS have topped 3,000 in a fortnight. Agency heads have been told they must consider employees' individual circumstances.